listening to the Pharmacy Podcast Network.
You're listening to Framework Focus, the podcast that explores trends, innovations, and insights in the long-term care pharmacy industry. Join us as we connect the entire LTC ecosystem.
Hello, and welcome once again to Framework Focus. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Fulton, and you are listening to our very special podcast, Framework Focus, brought to you by SoftWriters, the first and only software firm 100% focused on the unique needs and workflows of the long-term care pharmacy community. With me today are two very special guests. I am very privileged to introduce Dr. Stephen Albert, PhD. Dr. Albert is the leader of the Clinical and Population Outcomes Core, and also a professor of Behavioral and Community Health Sciences at the University of Pittsburgh. Also joining me is Dr. Aimee Pickering. Dr. Pickering is a physician. She is an assistant professor of medicine at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, and she is also a Pepper Scholar. She does research focused on de-implementing low-value care in older adults. My friends here from the Pepper Center, welcome to Framework Focus.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Well, before we get started, and get really into the nuts and bolts of what the Pepper Center is and what you guys do, tell me a little bit about your backgrounds and your career journey and how you ended up where you're at. Dr. Albert, let's start with you.
Oh, I have a long and convoluted route to where I am, I think. I started out as an anthropologist. I'm a card-carrying PhD in anthropology, but I got interested in aging and health, and I had a postdoctoral opportunity to retrain. That was at Columbia University and Rutgers before that. And I have spent a good chunk of my career looking at the functional significance of cognitive impairment in older people. What I mean by that is to say, how large a decline in memory do we need to see before someone has trouble bathing themselves or dressing themselves? So we're trying to correlate the functional implications of changes in neurocognitive abilities. So I started to do that for a long time, published a lot, had a number of grants in this area, but at some point, even a little surprising to me, which I can't exactly pinpoint when, I got tired of studying the pathologies of aging and wanted to look at prevention of poor health in old age. And that led me over to public health. So it was easier to change institutions than to change academic units where I was. And I had an opportunity to come to the University of Pittsburgh. And I very quickly hooked up with the Pepper Center here. Just to say a word about that for a second, and not to jump ahead of your questions, but the Pepper Center at Pitt really started in about 2005. It's in its fourth or fifth iteration now. It is a P30 NIH grant. That is, it's a training effort as well as a research effort. There are something like 25 Pepper Centers in the United States at the largest universities, and each of them has a topical specialty. Ours involves mobility and gait, but in the broadest sense, looking at the brain basis of balance and mobility limitations, as well as many of the cofactors, including inappropriate prescribing, let's say, or low-value prescriptions in the risk of falls and balance disorders. So we've been doing this at Pitt for a long time. Just for your audience who may not know, Claude Pepper was a senator in the United States and a great proponent of healthy aging. And he was so important to us that we've named these centers after him. Their full name is the Claude Pepper Older Americans Independence Centers.
You know, the Claude Pepper Centers are really fascinating to me. And honestly, I think it flies under the radar in a lot of ways, maybe among our listener community. Dr. Pepper, I thought was the soda named after a pharmacist, ironically. But really, the Dr. Pepper that we're talking about here with the Pepper Centers, very different Dr. Pepper, not the same, and does a lot of work, across the country for older Americans. Before we get into that, Dr. Pickering, let's hear your backstory.
Yeah. So like Mark said, I'm a physician. So I actually thought I wanted to do pediatrics when I started medical school. So I have gone to the other end of the spectrum. But I've always been interested in looking at ways to reduce low value care, which is care that's unnecessary, potentially harmful, can lead to lots of downstream harms and financial implications as well. So I first did a research project in medical school in neonates, looking at a low value practice in that population. Then I very quickly realized I did not like taking care of kids. So I did internal medicine and then really got interested in research in older adults. And so during residency, I worked on a number of projects examining patient and caregiver views on medication value. So did a lot of qualitative work. And then I did a research fellowship after residency to get more training in becoming a researcher, because we don't get so much of that during residency. It's really focused on clinical work. And so during that time, I focused a lot in the veteran population. And so examined downstream harms of certain low value practices in older veterans, such as PSA testing or low value cervical cancer screening. And then I started on faculty at the University of Pittsburgh in 2022. And that's when I actually learned about the Pepper Center as well. So I am one of the Pepper scholars. And so as Dr. Albert mentioned, one of the big aims of the Pepper Center is training. So they're really focused on training junior investigators to become independent researchers. And so through the Pepper Center, I participate in a number of career development opportunities, mentorship, and yeah, it's a really great opportunity to be connected to other more senior investigators in aging research, and there's a lot of resources as well. So it's been really instrumental in my career development. And I've kind of pivoted into de-prescribing in older adults. So still kind of in that low value care realm, just focused on potentially inappropriate medications.
That's really fascinating. When I think about, de-prescribing and low value care, it really makes me think about, some of the recent and not so recent developments we've had, really in the pharmacy industry. Just this past year, we've seen the FDA come out and finally acknowledge that like phenylephrine is not effective. And, we've known that forever in pharmacy and, finally getting some credibility to that. But, when we look at like low value medications and de-prescribing, it makes me think about, I don't know if you guys remember propoxyphene or Darvocet. We used to use that in pain all the time. When I first started in pharmacy, I mean, literally everybody over 60 was on Darvocet like 2 to 3 times a day. And, finally, it was a terrible drug, has very toxic metabolites, to norpropoxyphene. It's very nephrotoxic. And so finally it was removed from the market, a number of years ago. But I can tell you how much of that stuff we dispensed. And that's just really the tip of the iceberg. So let's talk about the Claude Pepper Center. So what is the Pepper Center in Pittsburgh? What is its mission? What does it do? And, tell us a little bit about kind of what your activities and roles are there.
Well, I can start if you like. As I said, the Pepper Center is in its 5th renewal, I believe. And we continue to do our research on mobility and gait. I think a nice cachet and something special about our center is that we really take on gait and mobility and balance from a multidisciplinary perspective. So we have a lot of bioengineers involved, as well as cognitive neuroscientists, and many of the allied health professionals are involved as well: physical therapy, occupational therapy, and I think a new effort now will be a lot more interest in assistive technologies and how they can promote independence in older people with mobility and gait disorders. But the Pepper Center itself has a series of different cores and a series of different projects and products. So we have a core that's involved with clinical and population outcomes. That's my particular effort, where we have a large research registry for older people in the community, as well as older people who live in age-specific housing. We also have a center that's involved in the biology of aging. They're very interested in senolytics, or new therapies or repurposed therapies that remove toxic degraded cells that can interfere with physiology. We also have a neurocognitive core and a statistics core and a training core. So this gives you the flavor of what Pepper Centers are focusing on and what they're required to do. As I said, ours is the only one specific to mobility and balance and gait, which we think is one of the keys to healthy aging. As we like to say, keeping people vertical and keeping them out of the hospital is half of the battle. So that's our focus. And the center itself is a series of faculty, a series of trainees at different points in the life cycle of research, from the junior scholars to postdocs. We have a bi-weekly seminar, which is a terrific opportunity open to the public. And each of the cores sponsors pilot projects and developmental research proposals. So I think the Pepper Center really makes a great contribution to aging on an entire university campus. And that's really one of our goals, I think, is to bring people who are doing other kinds of research into aging. They don't know they're studying aging. We sometimes have to educate them. And we also have to educate them on making aging friendly to older people. It's difficult just to drop an older person off, or anybody for that matter, in a large medical institution. Go find radiology. Park, find the right building, find the right floor, find the right address is quite difficult. So we advise other researchers on how to make research a little more approachable for older people. So let me stop there. Dr. Pickering, maybe you want to add your perspective.
Yeah, I can add. So like I mentioned, I'm one of the Pepper scholars. So I'm a more junior investigator, but the Pepper Center supports investigators, like Dr. Albert said, of all stages. And so like he said, there's postdocs. I'm one of 4 Pepper scholars. So the goal is really to support junior investigators in becoming independent aging researchers. So it's been really instrumental in my transition from a fellow to being an independent investigator. And so it's been helpful in my transition to faculty, definitely. And so, like I said, there's career development seminars, there's the research seminar that Dr. Albert mentioned, and then I've been able to get a lot of mentorships in other very much interdisciplinary mentorship. So one of my mentors is a physical therapist. It's a way to connect with other aging researchers. And then I also received a pilot funding through the Pepper Center to help supplement my research as well. And so, yeah, it's just a very supportive environment for junior investigators. And I think everybody in the Pepper Center is really enthusiastic about supporting, investigators at all stages, and they're really passionate about aging research as well. And so it's a really nice community to be a part of, and I am thankful to be a part of it. So.
I think you get the feel that we take aging as a whole person kind of approach. It's not just geriatrics, it's not just cardiology. We're looking at the old person as a totality. And I think that's really the challenge of geriatrics, old age medicine generally, but perhaps something that's applicable across the board.
I'm inclined to absolutely agree with you, Dr. Albert. When we look at, the older individual, the senior citizen, the folks who reside in the nation's long-term care facilities, whether those are skilled nursing facilities or assisted living, or maybe a group home for folks with disabilities who also, may be elderly. They have some of the most complicated, not just medication, but healthcare conditions of all people. They take lots of medications. On average, the average person takes around 16 meds every single day. They have multiple disease states, and these are the folks that are often forgotten about. We think about the places where we take care of our senior citizens, and they're places that everybody thinks they should be there, but nobody wants it in their backyard.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is, we have this aging baby boomer generation, the graying of America, and these folks aren't an accessory. They're people, and they're a really important demographic in this country. And the way we take care of them is evolving so quickly. And I see a lot of things. I've been to a number of events where I've seen age tech being focused, and we're seeing a lot of, I love how you talked about, Dr. Pickering, new technologies, working with bioengineers and, other disciplines to, bring out new ways of therapy, new ideas and ways we can treat existing disease states. One of the coolest things I've seen recently is AI chatbots or avatars for folks who are elderly to, treat loneliness and depression.
Right.
So tell us a little bit more about the research that you do at the Pepper Center, and what are some of your accomplishments and highlights? What are some of the things that you've been able to achieve?
Would you like to go first?
Sure, I can start. So the research that I'm involved with and that's being supported by both my through the Pepper Scholar Program. So I will add that the other nice thing about it is they support my time. So that has been really instrumental in getting my foot off the ground, because to be able to have protected time to do research is really important when you're more junior and you don't have, grant funding to pay for your time. To have the support of the Pepper Center to kind of transition me to the next stage has been very instrumental. So that's another thing that they've been able to support, to give me protected time to do research, and then also some pilot funding to actually do it as well. And so the project that I'm working on through this is focused on de-intensifying diabetes regimens in older adults who are overtreated for diabetes in the primary care setting, and specifically using implementation science, which is becoming more popular as a way to translate research findings and evidence-based practices into regular practice. And so the one quote or metric that implementation scientists always quote is that it takes 17 years for a research finding to actually be implemented in practice. It takes a really long time, and then only about 1 in 5 findings that have been proven to be evidence-based actually make it into practice. So we're doing all this important work, and we know, for example, we should be de-prescribing diabetes medications or other medications, but it's not actually being implemented. And so that's what I'm really interested in focusing on, kind of translating all this research into practice. And so the project involves interviewing key stakeholders, so patients, caregivers, and providers, to really learn about what are the barriers to implementing these guidelines that are pretty widely advertised and established, and then working with those stakeholders to develop strategies to support actually implementing the guidelines and then testing it. And so, thus far, in terms of this project, I've been able to complete interviews with all the stakeholders to determine barriers. And then in terms of other kind of accomplishments or things the Pepper Center has been able to support me in, because I've been given this time from them, I've been able to submit external grants as well, and just kind of boost up my productivity as a junior investigator. It's been very helpful.
Great. One nice feature of the Pepper Center is our research registries. So we have over 2,500 community dwelling older people who have pre-consented to participate in research. And by pre-consent, I mean they've given us their contact information. They complete an annual survey, so we have updated contact info on them. And we know something about their health status, which researchers can use to see if someone meets their inclusion-exclusion criteria for studies. Yes, thank you for showing some of the websites of our Platinum Registry, which has to do with age-specific housing, and we also have our Community Registry, which is a little broader than that. So the registry is very valuable. I think people don't appreciate that older people want, for the most part, to participate in research and are some of the best research participants because they're highly compliant and they like the stimulation and they have the time to participate in research if we make it easy for them to participate. Well, the reason I mentioned the registry is I have a study right now on de-prescribing in older adults drawing on our registry. And for that study, for example, we screen people. They have to be on 5 or more medications. It's one of the definitions of polypharmacy. And they have to pass a cognitive screener. And they have to have a stable relationship with a provider. And then we have a series of questions and inquiries where we try to get at a few important things. One is, do they know why they're taking the medicines they're taking? That is, do they properly identify the indication? And also, are they ready to de-prescribe given the right circumstances? And we measure readiness to de-prescribe using an established scale developed in the VA, actually. So that's available to us as well. And once you get that, you can see if people who differ in the number of comorbidities or their education levels or whether they've had a recent hospitalization are more or less ready to talk about de-prescribing with a physician. So while our study is not limited to diabetes, the way Dr. Pickering's study is, we are getting at some of the same sorts of things. And I think we're going to touch base a little bit about this and see how our findings concur or don't. And I would also add that our study is part of a cross-national investigation. I have colleagues in Japan as well doing the exact same study using a very interesting translation of this same questionnaire. And we'll be able to see if things like trust in your physician or proactive approaches to management of your own care differ in a Japanese older population and an American sample. And we expect that they will, but we'll see. So this has been one of the nice things to link something here to something abroad.
You know, I really appreciate that perspective because, we think about elder care. It's not just an American phenomenon, right? This is something that happens globally, and especially in cultures like Japan, where, they also have, a large aging population, but maybe some different cultural norms and mores that may impact, the way they approach, senior care.
Right.
So I think that's fascinating. And I want to deep dive a little bit more into de-prescribing and get into the nitty-gritty about what is low value care. But first, we're going to take a quick commercial break. We will be right back, so stick around on Framework Focus.
Hey, I just want to say thank you for listening to the Pharmacy Podcast Network. We are dedicated to bringing a myriad and diverse amount of content to you 6 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week. And it is all driven by pharmacists, educating pharmacists, pharmacy technicians sharing, pharmacy professionals helping to build the better and future pharmacy care model. Tune in, go subscribe on all platforms, Apple, Google, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, Pharmacy Podcast Network. Thank you for all that you do.
And welcome back to Framework Focus. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Fulton, the pharmacist here, and I am interviewing two very interesting guests today. We have Dr. Aimee Pickering and Dr. Stephen Albert from the Claude Pepper Center here in Pittsburgh. And before we stopped for a break, we were talking about the crux of your current research, which is on de-prescribing and low-value care. So help us understand for our listeners, what are those concepts? Tell us a little bit about what do we mean when we talk about low-value care and the impact of de-prescribing?
Yeah, I can start. I can take the low value care, and then I'll let Dr. Albert talk about de-prescribing. So low value care is a term that's defined as health care whose potential harm exceeds its potential benefit. That's kind of the broad accepted definition of it. So it could be any number of health services. So one common example is PSA testing in older adults. So lots of cancer screenings in older adults could be considered low value care, or unnecessary preoperative testing. And then in my mind, I think potentially inappropriate medications or unnecessary medications falls under that low value care bucket as well. And that's what Dr. Albert and I are interested in, is low value medications. And then all of these services, the other thing I always keep in mind that although, getting like a single PSA test or something like that, it seems very harmless. At the time, you're like, oh, okay, I can just, order this at the lab if the patient requests it. It's not that big of a deal. But an area that I've studied in the past are low value care cascades. And so those are downstream harms that could potentially be related to that initial service. So the example that I always like to think about is, that PSA test, it might seem harmless to get that lab, but then there might be a false negative, and then the patient needs a biopsy, and then it causes visits, and they lose time at work, and it causes psychological stress because they are worried that they have prostate cancer. And then so you always have to think about those downstream harms as well. And the same thing goes for medications. It might not seem that harmful at the time, but thinking about kind of consequences, cost, overall medication burden, all those things should be taken into account too. And then one way to at least combat low value medication use is de-prescribing. And I can let Dr. Albert take it on that one.
This is a very good point. When we say low value, it sounds like, well, it's just low value, but in fact, it's a patient safety issue as well. There really are harms. And I think a lot of, at some point, de-prescribing shades into identifying potentially inappropriate prescribing. And they really are part of a continuum. And I don't think people fully appreciate that. So medication safety is a low-hanging fruit for a larger patient safety issue. And one of the related areas I'm working on with colleagues in biomedical informatics is real-time automated detection of inappropriate prescribing that is potentially harmful, or at best low value, without, just not necessary, expensive, and maybe doing no one any good. So I think that's the larger frame for this, thinking about this whole thing. And you as a pharmacist, Mark, will say, why do people get so many prescription medications? And how come it's easier to add them than to take them away? And that's the kind of thing I think we need to think a little harder about. So,
well, you bring up a really good point, Dr. Albert, because when we think about the appropriate use of medications, especially in the senior population, the trend is to perpetuate everything that's already ongoing and then just keep adding and adding as these folks acquire or develop new disease states or pathologies. But the problem is someone has to be monitoring this. You can't just put it on autopilot, and that's why I think it's really cool that we have this very prominent role of the pharmacist in the long-term care community going in and doing the clinical consulting, doing chart reviews, and making recommendations, especially on, we tend to focus a lot on antibiotics and antipsychotics in the LTC community, but looking at drugs overall, the cost of medications keeps going up. And so, and long-term care facilities, don't keep getting more and more money. So it's even more important to be very judicious and critical about the strategy we use to medicate older adults and treat diseases and conditions, because increasingly, you look at the biologic drugs and these very expensive injectables. It's a really big decision to, do I initiate this treatment on somebody, where this is going to cost the health system a lot of money and thousands of dollars a month for this patient? Are we going to get the return on investment?
Right.
Are we going to get the value for that medication? And so, this trend towards value-based care, I think, really plays into, the research that you're doing on this. So if we go down the road and, as Dr. Pickering said, that there's this gap between theory and practice, right? Between knowing what to do, but implementing how to do it. What might we learn from your research, and what do you hope to discover, from your research into this issue of low value care and de-implementation?
Yeah, so I think the one thing which we kind of already know, but it's kind of come out, is there's lots of barriers to being able to do this successfully. And that's probably why, in the ideal, perfect kind of research situation, we've shown that these, it's important to de-prescribe, and it does result in, some improved outcomes. But when you actually get into like a real life clinical scenario, there's so many barriers to actually doing it. And that's why there actually haven't been very many successful de-prescribing interventions, because it's so hard to actually implement it. And one of the ones that's probably most well known and has been shown to actually be effective is called it's the Empower trial. But there are these like brochures that they sent out to patients. So there's a patient-facing component, and then it's a kind of a pharmacist-led intervention as well. So I think that kind of demonstrates, and we were talking about this before we started, Mark, but I think really taking an interdisciplinary approach is important, because that potentially overcomes some of the barriers that primary care doctors or the people who are prescribing face, and then they're not able to incorporate de-prescribing into their everyday practice, is like incorporating a pharmacist to do that medication review, incorporating, a diabetes nurse educator or a nurse. I think that's one thing that's come out in my work, and then, a lot of work in the de-prescribing areas. In interdisciplinary approach is really important to be effective. And then also we have to, especially in older adults, target not only the older adult, but also caregivers as well. I think that's really important because they rely a lot on their caregivers to make decisions. And then the other theme that always comes up when you're actually interviewing patients and caregivers is communication is really key. Like, how do we best communicate these conversations about de-prescribing? How do you elicit patient values and preferences to maybe align your recommendations to what they value? And I think more work is needed in this area, is like communication frameworks, or just improving communication and shared decision making. Because I think that's like the center of it all, really. At the end of the day, like, how do we communicate these recommendations effectively? Because older individuals are very attached to their medicines, and they're like, well, I've been on this for like so long, and now you're telling me to stop it, especially if they don't have side effects. I don't know where I'm going with this, but those are kind of the big themes I've seen. But
yeah, I would just emphasize, we can't speak of patients as completely passive in this either. They make decisions which they may or may not tell their physicians or healthcare professionals about, to stop or to taper or to take less of, or only when they feel a relevant symptom. So there's a lot of activity by patients which may or may not make it to the physician's office that we should recognize as well. And yeah, you're dealing with people with who can be complicated. So I think in our research, and we're still early on in it, but people, yes, there's a certain familiarity with medications that is comforting to people, and they're reluctant to stop for that reason, especially if they're feeling okay. But some 30 to 40% are having conversations with their doctors about their medications, and some 15% or so are independently making decisions to alter or stop, maybe without telling the practitioner. So it's a two-way street, I think. I think our presumption is less, could be better, but not everybody is aware that that's possible, I think.
Well,
So
you
yeah.
bring up a really good point,
Yeah.
because when we talk about, you mentioned that the comfort of
Mm.
medications, right? And there's this security blanket of, well, I don't want to stop taking X because I'm concerned about risk, concerned about what happens if I don't take this. And I think in the healthcare community, we tend to err on the side of caution more often than not in saying, well, it probably does, no benefit, but it's also not doing a lot of harm potentially. And so why don't we just leave it? And I think the downside of that is there's a lot of, unnecessary medications. It's an unnecessary cost burden for the healthcare system, for Medicare, as well as, for the pharmacy and for, the facilities where these folks reside.
Right. Right.
A lot of things changing hands, and we're just talking about medications, and that's just what they get from the pharmacy. Now, most older adults also take a lot of vitamins and supplements, which, you factor that in, and now you're up over like 20 or so different medications or things a day.
Right.
And you're
Yeah.
greatly increasing the potential for drug interactions, for
Right.
inappropriate dosages, durations of therapies, all sorts of your whole litany of drug-related problems.
Right.
So for our folks here listening, our audience is mostly long-term care providers, long-term care pharmacies, people who are interested in this, and listeners of the Pharmacy Podcast Network. In your perspective, how can long-term care providers implement a de-prescribing program? Let's say, how can the long-term care community, either the facility or the pharmacy, how can they really start a de-implementation program of their own?
A great question. I defer to you, Dr. Pickering, or I could jump in.
So I would say, I think heavily including the pharmacist in these initiatives is very important. And then I would say also potentially focusing on, because I think there's two schools of thought when people kind of think about de-prescribing interventions, like, should you do like a holistic review and identify all of the potentially inappropriate medications that a patient's on and try to like prioritize them some way or pick a couple to de-prescribe, or there's some targeted interventions where they're focusing on just on like one medication class. I would say probably easier to focus on one, maybe class of medications that we know is low value in this population, like PPIs is a good one, or like antipsychotics. And then it could potentially be scaled up once you come up with the intervention that's effective. I think the other thing that is very important when thinking about implementing these types of interventions is talking to like the end user of it. So like making sure you're designing it with the pharmacist or like whoever's going to be actually doing the intervention, and then determining like what are the barriers to your proposed intervention, or what would make it more effective. So I think including the end user in the design of the intervention as well is important.
Yeah, I think I would add there is some regulatory pressure, which sometimes those sorts of incentives can make a difference. I think the star rating for long-term care facilities requires that a certain percentage of people up to a certain percentage are on an antipsychotic, for example. Otherwise, a red flag goes off and something's not good. So there are those top-down pressures. That's kind of a blunt instrument. Maybe a better one is something we've been looking at, the automated detection of adverse events. So, in the medical record, you can detect falls or syncope or, non-responsive behavior. And these can flag something, and you correlate that with the medication someone is on. That could be an issue. And the third area that we've been paying attention to now is what we call failure modes, especially in the care transition. So someone's coming back to a long-term care facility from the hospital, and some drugs got started that never got removed, or this is seems like a little bit of a dangerous period for getting people back to stability in their medications. It happens also with a handoff between home care and long-term care, or the end of home care, things like that. So I think there are probably some system-based solutions that would go a long way. I think that's the big issue. So just one last thing. With my Japanese colleagues, we've shown that you can take a group of people leaving the hospital, and with a educational program to their providers and also to the patients, you can lower medications a little bit. We didn't see any particular class of medications, but that kind of guidance does help. Does it really help with longer term outcomes? That's a more challenging question. But just to get rid of the low value stuff, seems like you can do it with proper care and system level feedbacks.
One of the things that really sparks my interest, and I think ties in really closely to what we do at SoftWriters, which is long-term care pharmacy software and technology that can be used to help pharmacists operate more efficiently, more effectively, is when I think about integrations and reciprocity of data. I've talked about democratization of data on this show before, but we look at some of the federal guidelines that are requiring interoperability between healthcare systems. So that way you have, one record, that follows you around when you do a transition of care. So when you go from LTC to the hospital or to home, and then back again, we're not reinventing the wheel every single time and starting from scratch to build a med list. We know what this patient's on. We know their history, because these entities are being regulated to, share data. And today, with the development of the QHINs, or the Qualified Health Information Networks, I think those will be really impactful in driving interoperability and driving, clear information about the patient, between settings of care. One of the biggest hurdles we find in this, it's 2024, and one of the biggest challenges that we hear from facilities is, I wish I just had an accurate med list. Right. And how hard is it just to know what medications is this patient taking? It seems like a very simple question, but actually that is not easy. And if you ask 5 different providers of care for the same patient, you're going to get 5 different answers.
Right.
So really, it's about taking this idea of what to do. How do we identify low value care, and how to identify what types of interventions can be made, for that long-term care patient? And then, okay, how do I put that into practice? How do I actually do this, in my place of practice, so that I can start driving these better outcomes? For folks out there, now you mentioned there are 25 or so Pepper Centers across the U.S. And at SoftWriters, we have customers who are in all 50 states and practicing long-term care pharmacy everywhere from Alaska to Florida. So how can we get in touch? How can pharmacies get in touch with the Pepper Center? And what kind of resources can the Pepper Center provide to long-term care pharmacies or consultant pharmacists or long-term care facilities? And what kind of opportunities are there for research and collaboration?
That's a good question. You know, there is a national website for the Claude Pepper Centers. We're just one of many. They also have a national conference, and they have all kinds of educational materials, which I believe are open to the public, inter-center talks and resources. I think for your audience, some of the Pepper Centers have more of a focus on long-term care than others, and that may be a place to start. But I would go to the national site first. There's also something called the Research Coordinating Center Network, which links the Pepper Centers to other kinds of NIH-funded aging research. So there are many resources out there, and I am sure partnerships with practicing pharmacists would be really welcome. But I think, Mark, you've drawn attention to something very important geriatric pharmacy is one of those great neglected areas, I think. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, just like geriatric dentistry is another one. And there are opportunities, I think, to bring the people on the front line a little closer to the research community. We want to shorten that 17-year interval that Dr. Pickering mentioned a minute ago from our terrific research findings to something that actually makes a difference in somebody's life.
Yeah, I agree with that.
You know, bringing the practitioners into the fold would really be valuable, I think. I might add as a little plug for my own interest, the public health geriatric dentistry or public health geriatric pharmacy. That's even rarer, to try to think about these things on a population level rather than just on a clinical level is really still terra incognito. And I'm trying to encourage a cadre of young investigators to go this route. And we've had some success.
That's fascinating. I actually I took a class or two at the Graduate School of Public Health when I was in college and really enjoyed it. And again, my neighbor is a professor at the School of Public Health.
Oh.
So again, I have a lot of affinity and connection with the University of Pittsburgh and the wonderful work they do. You mentioned you have a biweekly seminar that's available. And so our listeners how do they get access to that? How can they listen in?
Well, this is I think our seminar series is coming to the end because we don't go through the summer. But they are open to, someone can write the Pepper Center and get a link to those. They're all on Zoom, for example. They are recorded, and I think that requires a little bit of extra asking for access. But certainly the live versions are available, and they are a terrific educational resource.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
I have really been privileged to be able to spend some time with you guys today and learn about the Pepper Center, learn about the research that you're doing and the impact that it's making, in the lives of the senior community every day. That's something that's really near and dear to my heart. At SoftWriters, our mission is to empower long-term care pharmacy and save lives. And it's really wonderful to know that there are partner organizations out there that are working on the same things and have the same values and missions. So from the bottom of my heart, I just want to say thank you so much for taking time to be my guest on the podcast today. And the door is open invite. Let us know. We're both Pittsburgh based. So if there's any way we can collaborate and help you guys out, definitely open to that in the future.
Great. Thanks for the invitation to address your audience, and nice to meet you a little more, Mark. And you got a great team over there doing a really valuable service.
Yeah, thank you so much for chatting with us.
The pleasure is all mine. This is Mark Fulton signing off. I want to thank Todd Urey and the Pharmacy Podcast Network. I want to thank Dr. Stephen Albert, Dr. Aimee Pickering, and the Pittsburgh Pepper Center. Please check out their website for more information. I want to thank you, our listeners. Thank you for making us your home, for listening to the news and the best conversations about long-term care pharmacy. My name is Dr. Mark Fulton, and we'll see you next time on Framework Focus.